Hello, my name is John Schneider. When I was a kid, I used to visit my Grandma Vi in the Jersey Bayshore area, and I'd take 8mm movies of my family and their friends. In fact, I was the family filmmaker. Today I live here, but traded my film camera for video, and recently shot this tugboat in the Shrewsbury River. Welcome to Jersey Bayshore Country. Where is the Jersey Bayshore? Let's get oriented by starting with the big picture. It's somewhere in here, part of the universe, and definitely part of our world. But it's like no place I've ever experienced. And as soon as we land, I'll show you around. These are my family's home movies from the very early 60s of the famous twin lights of Navesink, which overlook Highlands, New Jersey, which is part of the New Jersey Bayshore. And this is the so-called $1 million bridge, which was such a big deal at the time. Since then, the bridge has been replaced with the Captain Joseph Azzolino Bridge. Here's a clip of the home movie showing the beginning of Sandy Hook, and here's that same view today, also from the Twin Lights. And just once more, here's Highlands in the very early 60s, and here's the front of the Twin Lights with an old anchor on the ground, which is still there today, except in a slightly different spot. The Twin Lights of Navesink are as impressive to me today as they were yesterday. In fact, it's the first place I take visitors who come to the area for the first time, and they are always amazed. With an elevation of some 200 feet above sea level and a great view and a rich history, the Twin Lights is really a symbol for the Jersey Bayshore and a National Historic Landmark. The present-day Twin Lights were constructed in 1862, but the original Twin Lights were constructed 30 years prior in 1828 at the request of the American shipping industry, which asked Congress to replace the Sandy Hook Lighthouse, which had become operational in 1764, and it was the only lighthouse at the time serving ships entering the entrance to New York Harbor. So, in 1828, sea captains were welcomed with 2 new beacons from the Twin Lights as they made their way into New York Harbor. The Twin Lights emanated from this spot high above the Navesink and Highlands and overlooked Sandy Hook. The name of the facility at the time was the Navesink Light Station, but everybody kept calling it the Twin Lights, and the name stuck. Let's go back to my home movies for a minute. This is a Fresnel lens, and in 1841, the very first Fresnel lenses in the United States were installed in these towers. These lenses at the Twin Lights created a scientific revolution in our country, which led to all kinds of things like checkout scanners and camera lenses and fiber optic cables, fairly significant stuff. Oh, incidentally, when you visit the Twin Lights, take a look at the so-called mystery cannon from the 17th century. It was actually found on the grounds during construction in 1861, and people are still wondering how the heck did it get there. While the South Tower is usually closed to the public, the North Tower is open for climbing to the top. And from there, the views are even more spectacular, from New York City to Long Island to the ships in the Atlantic Ocean moving in and out of New York Harbor. You can also see the ferry, which shuttles back and forth between this area and New York. It's a very cool place to visit. The grounds around the Twin Lights are perfect for picnics or just sitting on a bench or under a tree to contemplate life. Well, I am looking at a model of the Twin Lights of Navesink. Some people say Navesink. Either is correct in my mind. And that's where we are today. I'm John Schneider, your host for another episode of Jersey Bayshore Country. And when I have a guest come to this part of the world, my part of the world, our part of the world, the very first place I bring them is right here to the Twin Lights of Navesink. And with me today is the Director of Collections for the museum, Mark Stewart. Mark, how are you?
Good. Thanks for coming, John.
Oh, I wouldn't miss this for the world. I've been wanting to do a show on the Twin Lights forever, but every time I wanted to do a show, something was happening here. And you've now developed something here that I think everybody all over the country ought to see. Let's start with that. You have a terrific museum in this place, don't you?
The Twin Lights Museum was recently renovated, top to bottom, end to end. We brought in about $2 million worth of artifacts, mostly historic American flags and other patriotic items. And we did this to kick off, you might call it a rebranding of the museum itself, because this is a place where the Pledge of Allegiance was given for the first time as our national oath of loyalty. So we really are hooking into that going forward.
Well, and not only that, there's all kinds of history involved with this lighthouse, or these lighthouses, I should say. And we're going to talk to Mark about a lot of that during this show. What can you tell us about the Twin Lights? How did it originate? What was here before it?
Well, because it's one of the highest points on the eastern seaboard, and because it stands atop the highlands as you come into New York Harbor, it's always been a very good place to let mariners know where they stood and keep them safe. So dating back over 200 years in bad weather, they often used to light bonfires here just to give people an idea. There's been a lighthouse out on Sandy Hook since the 1700s, but this helps people triangulate a little bit. A lot of people don't realize, because they see the ships coming in and out of New York Harbor just going straight in. Up until relatively recently, that was not a deep water approach. The safest way into New York Harbor, the deepest channel, required boats to come right at the Jersey shore, right at Sandy Hook, and then make a hard right into New York Harbor. So you can imagine, especially in the day of sailing ships, in a storm, if you missed that turn, if you didn't know exactly where you were, you would end up on the sandbars out here, and there's hundreds of wrecks out there.
Well, and there are two lights, and we'll take a look at that as we talk about it. There are two lights, and the idea was, I believe, that as a ship came in, the lights would move like that, or appear to move, and at some point, you'd only see one light. One light was flashing, one light was steady. What was the alignment for when the lights were together?
Well, it was a case of identifying where you were at sea, because you would see two lights next to each other. You would see the light out on Sandy Hook, and for many decades there was also a light ship out in the harbor there. So you could triangulate between those three and know exactly where you were. There was always twin lights here. They were constructed in 1828, and in 1841, the government decided that they would experiment with a Fresnel lens, which is in all lighthouses now, but at that point it was only being used in France and on the Atlantic coast of Europe. And the government sent Admiral Perry, who later became famous for opening up Japan, to check out the Fresnel lenses. He thought they were magnificent. He got a pair of them and brought them back here, and they decided this was the place where they would install them. So this is really, in a sense, where the science of optics began in the United States. Back then, it never really occurred to people that you could manipulate or bend light, and that's exactly what a Fresnel lens does.
And the Fresnel lens is magnificent. It's a beautiful work of art, really. And it must have been difficult to, what, did they have to carry it up the steps? Or did they manufacture it up there?
They made it in small sections, so it could be assembled, disassembled, carried up. And that's actually happened fairly recently. For a long time, the big Fresnel lens we have here was in the Boston Museum of Science.
Wow.
And in the late 70s, we asked for it back. And so they said sure, and so we as a group learned how to disassemble it, reassemble it, and all of the tricks of the trade, so to speak. The lighthouse that people visit today was built in 1862, and it functioned as a navigational aid until 1949, when it was decommissioned. Really, radar had taken over the duties of a traditional lighthouse, and they kept the lights on just so private navigation, small boats, could tell where they were in a difficult situation.
And it's made out of brownstone, and each tower is a different design. Do you know why each tower is different?
We haven't really been able to figure that out. The Lighthouse Board in the 1850s made that decision. We do know that members of the Lighthouse Board in Washington at that time were also board members of the Smithsonian Institute. And if you go to the National Mall and look at the old Smithsonian, you'll see a lot of common architecture with us here, including towers that are different shapes. One here is square, and another one has 8 sides.
And the Smithsonian in Washington, if memory serves me correctly, is made of brownstone, like the brownstone here. A lot of it is.
Some of it is, yeah. This brownstone was quarried in New Jersey.
There's so many things happened here. I mean, I don't even know where to begin. What was life like here? What was the country about in 1862? We were at war with ourselves. Wasn't the Civil War going on?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is the architecture of this is called fortress architecture. And it's one of the few buildings, and I think maybe the only lighthouse, that features this type of architecture. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the country was so fractured after the war that no one wanted to build anything that reminded them of war. And so this ended up being a relatively unique structure for that reason. Would have been tremendously important, had the Confederates started attacking north. That never happened.
What was life like in this country in 1862? What was Highlands, New Jersey like?
Well, the lower part of Highlands was basically a swamp. It had some fishermen and some local people, who worked the water. Up on the hill, you had some sea captains, and you had some other people involved in the maritime trade. The president was Abraham Lincoln, of course, and New Jersey was an interesting state in its relationship to Lincoln. It was the only state that voted against him in both elections. Very few people know that. And there's various reasons for that. A lot of it had to do with the fact that George McClellan, who ran against him in the second election, was from New Jersey, so he was sort of a favorite son. But also a lot of New Jersey, in the summertime in the 1860s and the 1850s, this is where families would come from Philadelphia, would come from southern cities to come up here for the summer where it was a lot more pleasant, and they would mix with people from the north here. So the Civil War was not a very popular war here. The boys who were fighting each other had been playing on the beaches here, most likely, and it was very hard for people to imagine that.
And New Jersey was the very last state to abolish slavery as well.
Yeah.
Now, was Lincoln here? Did he come to visit? Do you know?
No, not that we know of.
I'd like to know all about the Twin Lights Historical Society. You're involved in that. You're also involved with the Highlands Historical Society. Tell me about the first.
The Twin Lights Historical Society has been active here since the early 60s. I think technically it started in the 1950s. In the 1980s, it became a much more accelerated group in terms of beautifying the lighthouse, doing its upkeep, creating a museum. And over the years, I think we've been a big contributor to its success. Right now, 70 to 80,000 people a year visit here. That's a huge number. Part of the reason is because obviously a lighthouse is very understandable. It's free. It's probably the best view in New Jersey, and it's easy to get to. And of course, the Jersey Shore draws a lot of people. But we've capitalized on that recognition factor and tried each year to do something significant to improve the experience here. So as a historical society, we do the things that you would expect. We have a collection. I'm the head of the collections. We have a museum, which we're recently renovated, and it's magnificent. I think it's now probably the best.
We'll take a look at it during the show.
I think it's probably now the best small museum, at least in Monmouth County, if not the state. It's exceptional. The society also is here to promote the lighthouse in ways that interpret its history. It's not just about getting people here. For most historic sites, that's the main goal. How do we get people here? That's not a problem for us. In fact, we wish our parking lot was twice as large. But it's making people understand its significant place in history. That's really our mission here, interpreting that history. And we're fortunate to have a curator on site, a state curator, which is an unusual thing. And we have a very active board. Interesting thing about the Twin Lights Historical Society is our relationship with the state. Obviously, this is a state, it's a national historic landmark. It's a state site, so the state owns and runs the building. However, the society owns the collection, or 99% of it. And so we have a really interesting symbiotic relationship. we wouldn't have a museum for our artifacts if the state didn't run this site.
Sure.
But they wouldn't have artifacts for their museum if we didn't exist as a relatively mature organization. So we've been able to develop a really unique partnership, which hopefully will be a model for other organizations.
And I know that the state is cutting back on a lot of funding for a lot of its parks. How do you survive? How do you raise funds? How do you keep going?
Well, people who visit here are very generous. Even with $1 or $2 in a box or buying something in our museum store, we have a pretty robust group of members, which, needless to say, we're always trying to grow. We have very generous donors. A lot of people include us in their estate planning. People really love this place, and the sheer number of people that we attract here really enables us to stay afloat. And again, we're not paying the bills for this place. It's a state site, so all we have to do is keep the museum in shape and make sure our collection is up to date and that we're doing things correctly.
Well, it amazes me that there aren't more photographs and film about the building of this and the construction and the history. And I know that there were some lighthouse keepers that lived in the spot where we are doing this interview right now.
That's correct.
What do we know about some of those early light keepers?
Well, we have some family photographs, and they lived up here the way a normal family would, and they interacted with people in the town. And some of them were here for a few years. Some of them were here for a very long time. They raised families here. The head keeper and the assistant keeper had a pretty good living situation here. Some of the other people who would work on the machines and things up here, because this place generated its own power for many, many years, their accommodations were a little spare.
Now, I think I read something outside. There was a power generating building outside, which now houses some other artifacts that you're welcome to look at. But was this the first power generated lighthouse in the country?
Yeah, it was the first lighthouse to generate its own power.
Wow.
There were 2 gigantic engines in there, and we actually have a working scale model of one in there, which kids love to play. They push the button and it goes round and round.
Neat.
It was noisy, it was dirty, and it was expensive to run, but for a time when this place was off the grid, so to speak, that was the only option to power the lighthouse, to power the lenses. They were powered with different types of oils for a long time, including whale oil, but when the electricity came in here, they were the first to generate their own electricity, and for a while they had an arc light behind the lens, and it produced 25 million candle power. It was the brightest light probably in America at that time. And it could be seen 75 miles away. And if you're in a boat, you won't even see the twin lights until you're about 22 miles away. So another 50 miles out, you could still see the glow of the
curvature
light.
of the Earth would probably prevent them from seeing. Now, this light probably, in my mind, was seen by some of the early immigrants in the last century as they approached New York. It was probably the first thing they saw if it was at night.
Yes, it was. Well, during the day, too.
Really?
If you were on a boat and you were getting close to New York, the towers would be the first thing that you would see rising above the horizon. And in fact, that was the impetus for something called the Liberty Pole.
What's that?
The Liberty Pole was probably the tallest flagpole in the United States. There was a financier based in Newark named William McDowell. This is in the early 1890s. He was a big patriot. He traveled frequently across the Atlantic, and he noticed that as the ships, which had a lot of immigrants and steerage, would get close to New York, he saw the excitement the people would have as they saw the twin lights rise. And he felt that even higher than the twin lights should be a gigantic flag, sort of like an auto dealership flag on steroids.
Wow.
And he wanted to put one in every port, but he was specific because he was a New Jersey guy.
Yeah.
He specifically built one here. It was 135 feet tall. The towers are 65 feet tall. So imagine how tall these towers are and a flagpole twice that height. This thing was, if you were on a ship, you would see this American flag rising out of the water. It was a very, very dramatic thing. And when they inaugurated this flagpole, that is when they decided they would also partner with some other groups and present the Pledge of Allegiance as the oath of loyalty for the United States. That was all done here on an April day in 1893.
So 1893, the first time that the Pledge of Allegiance was recited publicly.
As the adult national oath. It was originally written in the fall of 1892 as part of a National Columbus Day celebration. Benjamin Harrison was the president. He gave it its full backing. He lost the election. Grover Cleveland won the presidency. He thought this was a great idea. Of course, he turned away from all of other Harrison's policies, but this thing moved forward very, very quickly, considering, how long ago this was. And, within 7 months, all of a sudden, it was the national oath. It ended up sort of in the dustbin of time. You don't see it in any New Jersey history books. New Jersey had a big 350th celebration recently. It was not on any of the material they had. So it's something that we're really putting a lot of effort behind. And in fact, we have produced a documentary called You Heard It Here First. Ed Asner, the actor, narrated the whole thing for us.
And how can people see it? They come here? Do they...
At the museum store. It'll be for sale, I'm sure.
Fantastic. Are they still the original words? Have we gotten into political correctness at all? Have the words changed over the years?
The words have changed over the years. The main change has been under God, those words that were added in the 1950s. Dwight Eisenhower was the president who, by the way, the president is allowed to change the Pledge of Allegiance. That's written into the flag code. He did under pressure from some patriotic groups, and this was in the middle of the Cold War, the Red Scare, so to speak.
Sure.
And a lot of people felt under God should be added to the Pledge of Allegiance because theoretically it could apply to any country.
Communists were considered to be godless back in those days,
yes,
right?
Communists were considered to be a godless culture, and that was very offensive to people, and they felt more than anything that is something that if you're pledging allegiance to a country, that should be in there too. This is a time when there was a huge influx of immigrants in the United States. And, not unlike today, people were saying, hey, all these people are coming from these strange parts of the world. How do we know they're going to be loyal to us? How do they know they'll fight for us in a war? How do we know they're not going to make a lot of money, send it home? How do we know they're not going to set off bombs? These were things that people were talking about, 120 some odd years ago. And so there was a significant push to come up with something that people would recite that would make them loyal to the United States. On April 25th, 1893, there was a big patriotic event happening right here, at which the Pledge of Allegiance was given as our oath of loyalty, national oath of loyalty, for the first time. There was, the following day, going to be the biggest naval review in American history happening in New York Harbor. And in fact, on the day that the Pledge of Allegiance was given up here, where they were dedicating the Liberty Pole, which we talked about earlier, there was a flotilla of naval warships from all over the world, 35 I believe, that were steaming up the coast. And as they passed by here, and as the famous John Paul Jones flag was being raised, they fired a salute. The New Jersey National Guard had a cannon here. They fired back. It was a huge, huge, huge event. It was probably not until 1976 when the tall ships came in that there were that type of event happen in New York. And so the ceremony that happened here was a very big deal. The next day there were parades in New York for days and days and days, and then right after that the Chicago World's Fair opened. It was a very big time in America, and we were kind of the trigger event for that thing.
You set upon designing a museum that would talk about that, but also about the American flag. Talk about the museum a little bit.
We decided to inaugurate the new museum with a special exhibit called Seen Stars, and the idea is every flag tells a story.
And to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
You know, this has been so incredible. We're going to have to go another half hour with the show, so we're going to divide this into two parts. And I hope you'll come back next week for part 2 of the Twin Lights of Navesink and the museum that is here. It is a marvelous place. And as always, if you see me out there flying a drone or camera in my hand or out in the boat, I hope you wave or tap me on the shoulder and say hello, because there's nothing more important than meeting you. I'll see you next week with part 2. Bye-bye, everybody.